Welcome everyone to Arctic Ocean Governance Cooperation After Conflict. Just a quick logistics note before I turn things over to Sarah Amish for introductions. This session is being recorded and the recording will be posted on the event page in a few days after the event. So if you have interested friends who would like to see it, please do check back then. And I think and Zoom attendees will be, you're welcome to submit your questions through the Zoom Q&A function at any time during the seminar. We'll also be taking questions from the in-person attendees and just passing the mic around the room later in the session. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Sarah.
Excellent, thank you so much. My name's Sarah Amish. So I've been an RA with the Arctic Initiative for about 1.5 years now. In the past year, I've had the pleasure of working with Fran Ulmer, our moderator, as well as Doug Kazi on a project looking at science diplomacy in the Arctic and through the lens of the International Whaling Commission and the Arctic Council. So this is certainly a topic that I will find interesting at least. So thank you so much everyone for coming, and I'm very pleased to introduce our illustrious speakers. So our first speaker, Andreas Ostegan, is a Fulbright scholar at both the Wilson Center and the Arctic Initiative at the Belfer Center. And he's a senior researcher at the Fridtjof Nansen Institute and a part-time senior advisor at the High North Center for Business and Governance at the Nord University in the Norwegian Arctic. Andreas holds several affiliations as a senior fellow for the Arctic Institute, a global fellow at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., and is an associate professor in Oslo New University College, where he teaches a course, Geopolitics in the Arctic. From the Norwegian Arctic, Ostegan specializes in Arctic security affairs, as well as ocean politics and governance more broadly. Our second speaker, Andrey Todorov, is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Belfer Center's Arctic Initiative. He is also a research fellow at the Primavak Institute of World Economy and the International Relations at the Russian Academy of Sciences. Previously, Andrey worked in the legal department at the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where he focused on issues of the international law of the sea. He holds a PhD in law from the Moscow State Linguistic University with research interest in the Arctic ocean governance and the international law of the sea, and focuses his research here on identifying opportunities for enhancing cooperation in shipping regulation in the Bering Strait region. And then our moderator, Fran Ulmer, who is there on the screen for those of you in person, has been senior fellow in the Arctic Initiative for the Belfer Center since 2019 and has served as the member of the U.S. Arctic Research Commission for 10 years, including chairing that body from March 2011 through July 2020. She is the former chancellor of the University of Alaska Anchorage and has served as an elected official both as lieutenant governor of Alaska and as mayor of Juneau. She is a member of the global board of the Nature Conservancy and on the board of the National Parks Conservation Association. And I will now turn it over to Fran on Zoom to start our session this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thanks to all of you who have joined us today. For those of us who live in the Arctic or the near Arctic, and for many of you who follow Arctic issues, you know that the Arctic has been changing dramatically over the last 40 years or so in pretty much every way. Warming temperatures and less sea ice, retreating glaciers, thawing permafrost, more fires, more coastal erosion, more flooding, and on and on and on. But it's not just the environment and the ecosystems that are changing. So is the society, the economics, the culture, the geopolitics in many ways, particularly recently. Now, these changes, yes, it's true that they're pretty much present throughout the Arctic, but in very different ways, depending upon what part of the Arctic you are in. There really are many Arctics, not just one. Today, we're going to focus on two areas in the Arctic, the Barents Sea and the Bering Sea, that share many similarities and some pretty significant differences. For all of the ways in which change is happening in the Arctic, these two regions really display some interesting thoughts and challenges and opportunities that we should consider about how both the geopolitics, the governance structures, and how current events elsewhere, like the Russian invasion of Ukraine, are going to have even bigger impacts as we move forward in the Arctic and throughout the world. So these two gentlemen have both spent a lot of time thinking about, researching, and writing about these two specific regions. And I am certain that all of us are going to learn a lot today. We will hear from first Andreas and then Andrey, and then we will open the floor to questions and comments and discussion. So without further ado, Andreas, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Fran. I hope you can hear me. I can't really see you. You're to the left of me back here. Is the PowerPoint slide up? Oh yeah, perfect. There it is. Perhaps you could just flip to the next one. It's a pleasure to be here speaking to you at the Harvard Belfer Center. So thank you for having me, for hosting me, especially thanks to the Arctic Initiative. And thanks for those who are following as well online, which I can see there, I guess. So as we just was highlighted in the introduction of me, I'm on this Fulbright tour where I was at the Wilson Center for about 6 weeks. And now I'll be here at the Harvard Belfer Center. And at the Wilson Center, I was looking specifically at the geopolitics of the Arctic. Whereas here at the Belfer Center, I'm more focused on the ocean governance dimension. Or I should say, in fact, what I'm really interested in is how to link these two fields, or, I mean, they're not really different fields, but at least link these topics. So ocean governance and Arctic geopolitics. And that's very much my work at the Fridtjof Nansen Institute in Oslo on an everyday basis as well. So that's what I'll try to do in my lecture right now. I'll look a bit at the initial ideas of this scramble for the Arctic, geopolitics in the Arctic. Then I'll go into a bit on ocean governance in the Arctic with some examples before I end up on the Bering Sea as one case study of ocean governance. And if you've done any Arctic research or looked into the Arctic geopolitics over the last few years or even decades, you've probably seen this cartoon that I'm highlighting here on the screen, and for those virtually as well on the Zoom. This is from 2007. It's from The Economist. So I'm stealing something from Cal, the cartoonist, who highlighted the discussions then, so 15 years ago, the discussions about the Arctic geopolitics. And I'm not going to spend much time talking about, the inaccuracies of this cartoon, but it does highlight something that is still very much of relevance today, and it's the increased attention given to the Arctic, given to the North. There's many reasons for this. This cartoon is inaccurate in many ways. It also depicts what some has termed kind of a scramble for the Arctic, the race for the Arctic, which also are very inaccurate descriptions to describe what is actually happening in the North. But they do capture some of the elements of, say, the increased attention that I was onto, whether it's the increased ice melting that we see, so the change in physical conditions in the Arctic, or not only increased ice melting, but just the fact that climate change is happening at a faster rate in the Arctic than elsewhere around the globe, which also leads to, as Fran was just highlighting, economic, political, societal changes also in the North. And what we've seen over the last 15 years since this cartoon is that researchers like myself and many of you in the room, and Andrey Todorov next to me as well, we've tried to nuance, right, these depictions. We've tried to examine specific ways that geopolitics in the Arctic is unfolding. And as Fran also highlighted, how it's unfolding not in the Arctic at large, not circumpolar, but actually in specific parts of the Arctic because of the Arctic's size or its vastness. But there's one thing really that comes to, that is part of the conclusion when you look at geopolitics in the High North, and it's the relevance of the law of the sea. So if we flip to the next slide, it's really the fundamental framework, right? Now I'm not aware of you following on Zoom, how much you follow Arctic daily news, right? But just to reiterate, right, that the law of the sea provides the fundamental framework for everything that takes place in the Arctic. And this is also why, and this map highlights it, why this idea of a scramble towards the Arctic or a race for resources does not really make sense. Because if you look on the map and you see actually the exclusive economic zones as are highlighted here, you see that these resources that the Arctic states are interested in, whether it's oil and gas, offshore oil and gas resources, minerals at sea, or marine living resources, they're predominantly within the realms of the Arctic states already. They already have the sovereign rights, the international legal framework to develop these resources if they see that in interest. The problem has more been the lack of infrastructure, the low commodity prices, limited interest in developing these resources. So it's just important to highlight, right? The law of the sea governs most of what happens in the Arctic. However, that does not mean that the Arctic is completely uninteresting from a geopolitical perspective, or that the Arctic is completely free from any dispute or conflict. And there's two axes here, two dimensions of, say, so-called geopolitics in the Arctic. Going back to also my initial point that I was making, trying to link Arctic geopolitics with ocean governance. And the first one that we might not discuss too much today, I mean, the topic of today's seminar is ocean governance, but the first one is the Arctic as an arena for conflicts in other parts of the world. I mean, the Arctic being utilized either in a symbolic manner, in a strategic manner, or as an arena for conflict because of Russia's dominant position in the Arctic. And we've seen increased tension in the Arctic over the last, say, few years, ever since 2014, but especially over the last few months after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We see increased tension also in the Arctic because the Arctic is so important to some of Russia's strategic military forces. But this is very specific to a certain part of the Arctic. It's not circumpolar. It's specific to predominantly the European parts of the Arctic and to some extent American or Bering Sea, Bering Strait region of the Arctic. So basically those two domains where Russia meets a NATO country, whether it's maritime border or land border, being Norway and the US. If you flip to the next slide, it highlights this as well. The red circles are those two parts of the Arctic where Russia meets another NATO country at sea and on land in the case of Norway. So that's one way that the Arctic is becoming more and more relevant in geopolitics, in security considerations, but not because of events in the Arctic in and of itself, right? It's not an Arctic dispute. It's not a territorial dispute or a maritime dispute in the Arctic that is causing this attention. And that takes me to the second point, or the second dimension of Arctic geopolitics, which is that one that links to ocean governance. Because there are also, in addition to this point, there are issues in the Arctic that are of concern, that have a conflictual dimension or that might cause conflict, and they relate to ocean governance, or they relate to how to manage or deal with a rapidly changing maritime environment and the resource management within that same environment. And in what's interesting in looking at ocean governance issues, or those specific disputes that might arise or have arisen when it comes to ocean governance in the Arctic, is that they actually, in contrast to my first point about the Arctic being dragged into conflict because of issues elsewhere, where Russia is the adversary, in these issues, ocean governance issues, Russia is in fact a partner, or someone you have to collaborate with, have dialogue with to solve these issues, or at least keep them from escalating further. And Fran and Andrey can probably expand on these as well, but just to give a very brief set of examples, right? We have, for example, the dispute or the potential dispute of how to delineate extended continental shelves in the Arctic. So if you're familiar with law of the sea, you know that you can extend your continental shelf beyond the 200 nautical mile zones that I highlighted before. This might become a dispute because it's highly likely that Russia, Canada, and the Kingdom of Denmark might overlap in their claims, claiming the North Pole or even claiming more of the continental shelf in the Arctic. Not a conflict per se, but a dispute that is probably going to emerge and probably will need a solution, either bilateral or trilateral negotiations, which includes Russia. One example. The other example is over the legal status of the passages, or the passageways in the Arctic. Northwest Passage going through primarily Canada, Northeast Passage going through primarily Russia. There is a dispute or disagreement between Canada, and not between Canada and Russia, but Canada and Russia holds differing views from the other countries, in particular the US, when it comes to the legal status of these passageways under law of the sea, whether or not they're the legal international waterways or if they're internal waters. And then finally, another example of also the ocean governance issues. So maybe not a dispute per se, but something that is probably going to keep attracting attention in years to come. And it's how to best regulate and manage the central Arctic Ocean. So again, referring back to the map that I highlighted of the exclusive economic zones, in 2018, an agreement was signed between 5 Arctic coastal states and five other interested actors that concerns how to regulate and govern the central Arctic Ocean. But that didn't settle the issue completely. This is an issue that's going to come up again, and given again Russia's prominent position in the Arctic, half the Arctic being Russian, Russia is key there as well. And the point with all these examples is that you might say, okay, this is not room for great power conflict. This will not lead to outright military war anytime soon. But there are still disputes in the Arctic that requires cooperation and requires, in some instances, solution, practical and long-term management. And there's one more aspect of, say, ocean governance in the Arctic. The one dimension that is probably the most conflictual, that has the most conflict potential, and that's fisheries, how to manage marine living resources. But here again, going also to Fran's point, you can't look at the Arctic as a whole. You can't say that all of the Arctic is facing the similar challenges. Again, these 2 parts of the Arctic that are highlighted on this map in red face particular challenges because they're maritime domains that are experiencing rapid change, as we already talked about and highlighted, but they also include, or they have the factor that they require cooperation with Russia or some form of dialogue with Russia, which is now, after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, becoming increasingly difficult. And I think I've already spent most of my time now, but just to very briefly turn to the Barents Sea as an example or a case study of this exact thing. So the Barents Sea, the top of the map, the upmost red circle, is experiencing climate change. In many ways, the fish stocks are moving. Most likely, I mean, it's very difficult to put a definite line under any research, but it most likely because of climatic effects, the fish stocks are moving. The size and importance of the fisheries in the Barents Sea cannot be underestimated. It's the rationale for why a lot of the communities, towns are in Northwest Russia and in North Norway. It's because of the marine living resources, not because of oil and gas or shipping, but because of these resources. There is a form of governance mechanisms, or actually multiple governance mechanisms in the Barents Sea that are set up to deal with how do you delineate or how do you divide quotas in the north. Norway and Russia has a bilateral co-management system that has been in place since the 70s, was formally expanded in the 90s, and is still hailed by many as the foremost example of fishery co-management, not in the Arctic, but in a global context. You have the Svalbard Treaty from 1920 that governs also, to some extent, the archipelago, but also there's a dispute whether or not it governs the maritime zone around Svalbard, which also plays into this, that I guess Andrey will also get to in a bit. And then finally, you have, linking back to my initial point about Arctic geopolitics and how certain parts of the Arctic are being or could be dragged into security relations, Russia and NATO are increasingly showcasing their military capabilities. This is the Barents Sea, is where the Northern Fleet basically sails out into when it goes on mission. And you see increased military activity from Russia and from NATO in this very same domain. And we could discuss the Barents Sea cooperation and similarities to the Bering Sea cooperation, and I guess we can get into that. But the point is also, going back to my initial point or my initial argument about Arctic geopolitics being both the spillover, the Arctic being dragged into geopolitics or great power competition, but also the, say, small scale disputes that you have in the Arctic that require, say, a solution or a cooperation. And there's an interlinkage or interplay between these issues, exactly because, as I've highlighted, right, the fishery management aspects or the legal status of the passageways in the Arctic that need to be dealt with are also occurring in the same domain geographically as where you have increased military activity and tension between Russia and NATO, especially after the invasion of Ukraine. So I'll more or less end there. I just would like to highlight three key lessons if you look at Arctic ocean governance, or even more broadly ocean governance, that might be relevant. And the first one is to nip it in the bud, if you will, or it basically concerns, if you look at ocean governance more widely, not only in the Arctic, how do you deal with ocean governance issues, especially those of who has what rights where, delineation of sovereign rights, maritime boundary negotiations, etc. And there is one clear lesson, and it is that it's better to deal with these things before they become a problem. I mean, it's not really the nature of public policy or international relations, right? Attention goes to immediate issues and crises. But if you look at maritime delimitation between, for example, Norway and Russia in 2010, or you look at the Central Arctic Ocean Fishery Agreement from 2018, these were settled or made before serious issues arose. The second point is the depoliticization of governance structures. I mean, both in terms of depoliticizing the structures themselves, the meetings are done between technocrats, not politicians, and they adhere to scientific advice that is also doesn't come from politicians or even from governments themselves, but from third parties. So depoliticizing ocean governance seems to hold extreme relevance in an Arctic context vis-a-vis Russia. And the final aspect is what I've been trying to get at in this whole presentation now, and it's to see the wider picture. Ocean governance issues, yes, they are very specific and require probably specific approaches, but the wider context, the geopolitical context, security context that they are in, define also a lot of the scope for maneuver. So I've definitely spent 5 minutes too much of my time now, but hopefully we can debate a bit more later on. So thank you.
Thanks, Andreas, for this very good overview of Arctic issues and interrelation of different security aspects and ocean governance. For a start, I would say that for a Russian scholar, it's very hard to talk about Arctic issues amidst the Ukrainian humanitarian disaster that is unraveling in Ukraine right now. So first and foremost, my thoughts go to Ukrainian people and those in Russia who found themselves in difficult situation because of that. Unfortunately, as we can see, the conflict and the crisis, Arctic is not immune from this crisis. By the way, Arctic is also home for 4 million people, and one could hardly expect that resumption of cooperation with Russia in the Arctic will happen soon. But yet to keep this conflict from further creeping into the region, we should, we and Arctic expert community and Arctic nations and governments should bear in mind that there are still very important issues in the Arctic that can be dealt only multilaterally and in cooperation with Russia after the most critical stage of the conflict comes to an end. Although the Arctic is not a global commons like, for example, Antarctica, which is where all the world nations have equal access, and the Arctic coastal states have sovereignty and sovereign rights over vast marine areas in the Arctic Ocean. It is still a region of shared governance with a lot of challenges that could be addressed only multilaterally. That doesn't mean, of course, that the Arctic 7 will not be able to proceed without Russia. But in my opinion, such cooperation, such minus Russia cooperation, would be with limited efficiency, and this refers particularly to some specific issues and even entire subregions. Fran and Andreas have mentioned the Barents Sea region and the Bering Strait region, and I would elaborate a little bit on these two subregions. What makes them similar? I mean, not Fran and Andreas, but the two regions, is that in both regions, Russia is one of the key stakeholders. Both areas are facing considerable challenges that come to these regions from outside. This refers to climate change, retreat of ice, increased interest from non-regional states, increased human activities coming from outside, redistribution of marine living resources, and so on. In both regions, the bordering states, Russia and Norway and Russia and USA, have developed a reliable legal framework for co-management of different activities. And in both regions, the coastal states have successfully solved the maritime delimitation problem. On the other hand, these two regions are not completely similar, and there are a lot of differences, specific features. The Bering Strait region is is featured by cold climate and remoteness from economic and population centers, and infrastructure here is minimal. The Barents region, to the contrary, is a relatively developed region with a very sizable population, major urban hubs, and modern economies. In particular, to compare to the two regions, 1.5 million people live in the Barents Sea region compared to only 50,000 people in the Bering Strait region. So you can feel the difference. Because of the effects of the Gulf Stream, the Barents Sea region, the southern portion of the Barents Sea region have remained ice-free year-round. And this makes development of different industries and economic activities less challenging and more cost-effective. The Bering Strait region, to the contrary, is covered with ice at least half of the year. And also there are some differences in legal terms because unlike the Bering Strait region, which is completely covered by exclusive economic zones of USA and Russia, the Barents Sea region has a high sea portion, which is called the loophole. And also this refers to disagreements around the legal status of Svalbard waters around Svalbard, which is, by the way, also a local dispute, Arctic-rooted dispute, which emerged between the parties, state parties, signatories to the 1920 Paris Spitsbergen Treaty. The unique features of the two regions have shaped the differences of a set of so the two regions have a different set of issues that are included in the shared management regimes between the coastal states. The Barents Sea region is one of the most intensive fisheries area in the world, and it's logical that Norway and Russia, most of the agreements between Norway and Russia deal with fisheries. The two Barents coastal states have a long and mostly successful history of cooperation on fisheries. Andreas mentioned that. There is a joint Russian-Norwegian Fisheries Commission, which coordinates research on fish stocks, monitors the conditions of these fish stocks, distributes quotas, including to non-regional states. And even the Svalbard disagreements do not impede Norway and Russia to very successfully cooperate on operational level, but still maintaining their dissenting opinions intact. The fisheries cooperation in the Bering Strait region, to the contrary, is not as relevant as in the Barents region. Most of the catches here are made in the southern parts of the Bering Sea, outside of the Bering Strait region, while commercial fishing in the Chukchi Sea in US federal waters is prohibited, and the Russian fisheries are very limited and small. At the same time, the Bering Strait itself is a very important, unique choke point because it connects. It's the only connection between the Arctic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean for ships. And at the same time, it is a very sensitive, recognized sensitive marine area, which is vitally important for migrating species like whales, for millions of birds, and of course, for local communities which are dependent on subsistence economies. And shipping is the most rapidly increasing activity in the Bering Strait region and most pressing challenge in the region. And the main driver for this trend is the development of the Northern Sea route, of course. Probably Western sanctions will slow down the pace of development of the Russian Arctic projects to some extent, but on the other hand, Russia could redirect some of its exports to Asian markets, meaning that more ships will pass through the Bering Strait. It's no wonder that Russia and USA recently have speeded up their collaboration on shipping management, and even the Ukrainian crisis of 2014 has not impeded them from building on different measures. For example, last year, Russia and USA updated the joint contingency planning and oil response collaboration. And in 2018, they submitted a joint proposal to International Maritime Organization for establishment of a two-way separation scheme in the Bering Strait region, which was approved by IMO. But I suppose more action will be needed in future, like establishing of areas to be avoided, particular sensitive area, ship reporting system, and so on. Future needs in cooperation with Russia will not be limited only to fisheries in the Barents Strait region and shipping in the Bering Strait region. Possibly there will be a need to harmonize national fisheries regimes for the Bering Strait region because right now, USA, as I mentioned, there is a ban on commercial fisheries in Chukchi Sea, while there is no such a ban on the Russian side. So they could consider achieving a more holistic framework for sustainable use of fish stocks in the Bering Strait region. Or a need can arise in the Barents region for managing shipping, taking into account the increasing interest from non-regional states and increasing shipping activity in this area. Even more, for both regions, new challenges can be not limited to only sectoral needs like fisheries or shipping, but require more cross-sectoral, cross-border approaches like implementing the marine spatial planning, ecosystem-based approach, designation of marine protected areas, and so on. So therefore, the significance of cooperation with Russia in these two areas will only increase in future. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you both very much. And I know I am speaking on behalf of the audience. You have given us a lot to think about and ponder as to both these differences and similarities, but also what might happen in the future. And I guess I would like to just start with a question that hopefully both of you might consider addressing before we launch into questions from the audience. You have both painted a picture that tells me Russia and Norway need each other with vis-a-vis fisheries, and Russia and Alaska, US need each other with regard to shipping. And what I mean by that is, there you are in the Barents with a robust fishery that both countries are interested in, and a pre-existing pattern of cooperation, both for science, research, and management. And the beginning of that in the Bering Strait with regard to Russia, Alaska, and the US in trying to sort out the way in which shipping could be made safer in the Bering Strait. So in a way, you have in both of these places, the two countries closest to these areas with a vested interest in trying anyway, at some level, to maintain the cooperation of the past and building upon that for economic mutual interest, safety as well. So given where we are right now with the state of relations with Russia, do you have, either of you have any thoughts about how the differences in those two regions and the mutual self-interest, so to speak, in those two areas because of fisheries in one and shipping in the other, might be able to go forward even during this period of the Russian-Ukraine conflict? Any thoughts about that?
Thank you very much, Fran, for a complex, difficult question. I think it's important to recognize, and you're highlighting it as well, and I probably could have mentioned or made more of a point of it in my presentation, that as Norway has followed the sanctions of EU and other Western countries towards Russia after the invasion of Ukraine, Norway has still protected and explicitly stated that it desires to protect the co-management system in the Barents Sea. It's not the only thing that Norway has left out of the sanctions. Norway also protects or safeguards cooperation with Russia on emergency management in the Barents Sea, so search and rescue, oil spill response. There is still ongoing cooperation or sharing of information when it comes to dealing with nuclear waste. There's sometimes nuclear waste transported along the Norwegian coast from Russia. You can imagine an accident happening at sea with such waste and the consequences of that. And there's also cooperation when it comes to Svalbard that both Andrey and I have mentioned, where on Svalbard, Norwegian territory, you have a sizable, large Russian community. So cooperation is necessary. And the Norwegian government has been very clear that these things are not too big to fail in a way. I mean, you could still see a suspension also on cooperation on fishery management and search and rescue and other aspects if tensions were to increase even further. So that's an important point, that yes, these things are safeguarded for now, but they're not. It's not certain that they will always be. But I think the Norwegian government and the government took office only 6 months ago, have a rather pragmatic view of its relations with Russia and the need for, as you say, Fran, to find common solutions on areas where you have to, because the alternative in the 90s, the cod stock, especially in the Barents Sea, was suffering a sharp decline. There were fears of basically that the stock would collapse. And as I highlighted in my presentation, the Barents Sea cod stock is the largest cod stock in the world. And it feeds many people, but it also is extremely important for the economy in the Arctic, or in this part of the Arctic. So to safeguard this, I think, is a priority. But I think, and I listened to the Norwegian foreign minister's speech in Tromsø just a few days ago, and from her tone, it seems that the approach now is not necessarily how can we expand cooperation or what more can we do. It's more how do we stop, say, the dominoes from falling, even further, or how do we stop things from deteriorating even more in the Arctic. So I think that's at least where we're at right now. But also to Andrei's point about seeing, how you can learn from the Barents Sea cooperation in the Bering Sea or vice versa is quite interesting when things hopefully will say die down a bit and it's more possible to talk of increasing cooperation again.
Thank you, Fran, for your question. As I said, there will be a need for Russia, Norway, and Russia, USA to cooperate further. Unfortunately, recently I've seen some negative signs of this non-Arctic issues impacting even cooperation between Russia and Norway on fisheries in Barents Sea. For example, under the work of the Joint Fisheries Commission of Russia and Norway, each of these countries distribute quotas to each other to allow fishing in their exclusive economic zone. So Norway can fish in Russian economic zone. And recently, Norwegian Fisheries Agency has recommended to its fishing fleet to avoid fishing in Russian exclusive economic zone because of the military exercises in this area. I hope that they will continue cooperation after the dust settles, so to speak. Andreas spoke very good about the Barents Sea. I will just mention one brief example on how Russia and USA could cooperate build on existing measures in the Bering Strait. Because today there is a need to protect the Delineate Islands that are located in the middle of the Bering Strait from increasing shipping. And USA has recommended, US Coast Guard has recommended to designate area to be avoided around these two islands. It would be an ideal scenario where when the two bordering states could again make a joint proposal to International Maritime Organization to protect both islands from shipping, from the risks stemming from increasing shipping, because one island is located on the Russian side and the other on the US side. But unfortunately, just have been making research on this issue. Unfortunately, there are I can't see that in the nearest future the two countries can step in together and make such a joint proposal. Probably they can make different proposals unilaterally, and then IMO, the International Maritime Organization, can do something with these two, unite them into one, combine them into one area to be avoided. But we will see. I hope in some time we will see continuation of collaboration.
Are there any questions in the room at Harvard? Because we have several online.
Yeah. Hello. Yeah. Hi. Thank you very much. It's a great event, and congratulations. It's convening, and of course, my humble. So Carlos, I'm on leave from the World Bank at the engineering school, so I'm at the other side of the river, and I don't follow this as much, but the ratification of the protocols in 2011 between YOLOs seemed to be an impressive display. So my question is on a more technical side, how should we think about marine scientific research being conducted within these different EEZs? And I understand that these trips are very expensive to plan out, and how should these processes or governance be done? Do you think that international organizations should be involved in this or not, in a way that starts to coordinate these processes so that the research can continue? Or do you think it's, yeah, thank you.
thank you. Can you hear me? Thank you for the question. Yeah, as a lawyer, I will start from saying that marine scientific research in the exclusive economic zones, if that is what you're asking, is under the sovereign right and exclusive jurisdiction of coastal states. So Russia and Norway, Russia and USA have exclusive rights to do and to allow marine scientific research by other countries in these areas. But I would say that marine scientific research is one of the key areas where every Arctic nation understands the importance of collaboration. And for example, this refers to fisheries management in the Bering Sea region, because the joint Russian-Norwegian committee, so it relies in its decisions relies on scientific data from ICES and also from regional fisheries organizations called NIAFC. It's a regional fisheries management organization for the North Atlantic. They also make some research. So that is one of the most important and significant area for cooperation in the Arctic too. And also this will be a very challenging thing with regard to the Central Arctic ocean part, because maybe you heard that recently Arctic nations, 5 Arctic coastal states and 5 big fishing nations concluded an agreement to ban commercial fishing in the Central Arctic Ocean. And also they agreed to establish a joint scientific program to monitor, to increase their knowledge about the biodiversity and the living marine resources in this particular area, because right now this topic is very understudied.
Thank you.
And let me jump in on that last question briefly before I give you one of the questions from online. The last agreement that the Arctic Council actually negotiated and adopted pertained to international cooperation in science in the Arctic. It reflected a serious commitment on the part of all of the Arctic 8 nations to do what they can to improve the ability of scientists, whether they are coming from official government agencies or other organizations, frankly, universities, et cetera, to be able to have access across borders, to be able to do the kind of research which helps everyone better understand the Arctic system and its changes. So I would say that there has been actually a long history of cooperation in this space, both in terms of government and academia, but also private organizations as well, which have contributed greatly to both the funding of and the operation of the research that has been done. Right now, because of the strained relationship with Russia, even some of those scientific organizations have backed away from the kinds of open participation which previously existed, regardless of what country of origin that scientist was. So I would say that even in this space, there has been a chilling effect as a result of what has happened elsewhere outside the Arctic. It is impacting the cooperation in a way that, for those of us who have spent a fair amount of time in the science world in one way or another, very much regret. It is something that at an individual scientist level, however, there is still going to be considerable cooperation to the extent that it can avoid the political entanglements. And I think there is a lot of support within the scientific community to continue in whatever way possible. Again, regardless of whether or not these are government, academia, or private sector organizations, that won't stop, but I'm afraid in some contexts, particularly as Andrey described in terms of what needs to be done to set up the science organization and cooperation for the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement, That has been delayed, unfortunately. So let me move to one of the questions that we received online, and that is with regard to the European Union and the role of the European Union in Arctic affairs. So the question was very broadly in that context of what role can and should the EU be playing, but perhaps even more specifically in the Barents Sea, perhaps how that has helped or not in the past, and particularly as it relates to governance.
Thank you, Fran. That's another complicated question. What role should the EU play in Arctic governance affairs? How much time do we have left? I mean, the EU, right, is in some respects, and not all, but in some aspects representing Arctic countries, right? Sweden and Finland and Denmark, although Greenland left the EU, but still, the Kingdom of Denmark is an Arctic country. So of course the EU has a role to play. The EU is relevant in many discussions, perhaps maybe more so in ocean governance issues, which is relevant for this seminar than in many other aspects. Fishery management in particular, where the Commission or the EU has exclusive competence from its member states. The EU has a definite role to play. I mean, if we look at the Barents Sea more specifically, we could spend a lot of time talking about the disputes that has been between the EU and especially Norway when it comes to how to manage fisheries around Svalbard, both fisheries of snow crab and fisheries of cod, or how much cod quota that the EU should get after Brexit, although that issue was actually resolved a few weeks ago. So that's a positive news, at least. I mean, to answer that question, again, the EU obviously has a role to play, right? The EU is an Arctic actor, it's an Arctic entity, it has an interest in the Arctic. Ursula von der Leyen's commission has obviously a geopolitical ambition. When she took office, she highlighted that they would be the first geopolitical commission, also highlighting that the EU is not only concerned with what it has exclusive competence over, but also increasingly engaged in foreign policy affairs. That also means the Arctic, that also means dealing with Russia in the Arctic. But beyond that, I mean, it's still a question of the instruments that the EU has to play with. The EU is not a coastal state per se in the Arctic, right? So the EU cannot intervene in the same way that coastal states can. The EU does not have exclusive competence over foreign affairs, so it cannot engage with Russia the way some of its countries can. And now you also have the debate when it comes to security, NATO and the EU and division of labor, especially if Sweden and Finland were to join NATO, as it looks highly likely to. So, I mean, the question is a good one, but it's a complex one with no clear answer. I'm sorry for that. Andrey, do you?
I think that the most valuable contribution that the EU can bring to the Arctic, and they have done it for many years, is the Arctic research. Coming back to the question about the marine scientific research, and I think they also stated in their own Arctic policy document that science diplomacy and scientific research are the key areas where the EU is and will be active in the Arctic. I would say, for example, coming back to the Barents Sea, the Bering Sea is included in the area of the regional fisheries management organization called NIAFC, which I mentioned before, and many countries from the EU are parties to this organization, and they are doing a very useful and valuable research on fisheries, and they even cover a small area of the Central Arctic Ocean. So I would say that this is one of the key and valuable contribution of the EU.
Other question in the room? Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nadezhda Filimonova, a predoctoral scholar with Belfer Center. And thank you, Andrey and Andreas, for your very wonderful presentations, and Fran for leading the discussion. I have two questions, one for both of you that regards the Arctic governance. From your presentation, I got kind of a feeling that you were talking more about, of course, the major role of states, and then there was a question about the EU. But what kind of gaps you see in the current Arctic Ocean governance, and whether you see some of the mechanisms to improve it, just regarding what is happening geopolitically. And a personal question to Andreas, as just taking the benefit that you are coming from Oslo, maybe you can kind of highlight some of the probably ongoing discussions about Norway taking over the Arctic chairmanship next year after this very unfortunate pause with the Russian chairmanship due to the current events. Thank you.
Thank you for the question, Nadia. So what gaps in Arctic governance do I see? Arctic governance, Arctic Ocean governance, I would say is one of the best examples of good and useful and fruitful governance in the world, but it's far from ideal. I would say the most evident gap in Arctic governance, Arctic Ocean governance, is a sectoral approach to managing everything. Because UNCLOS, and if you look at other arrangements, institutes like, for example, in Bering Sea and Bering Strait, they're all focused on different separate sectors like shipping, fishing, or protection of environment. They are all different and not combined in one. But the challenges that the Arctic region faces today, they don't acknowledge sectors. Yeah, they don't acknowledge the difference between institutions, and we see that more and more activities. We see more and more that there is an interdependence of different activities in the Arctic, and their cumulative effects on the marine environment and local communities. So I would say Arctic states will need to move towards the cross-sectoral and more holistic approach towards governing marine areas, and they started to consider it. And I think a major contribution to that will be an agreement that will complement the UNCLOS agreement on protection of marine biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction. There are areas beyond national jurisdiction in the Arctic too. So currently, this BBNJ, the so-called BBNJ agreement, is negotiated in the UN. It will be a global instrument, but it will have a very clear projection of in the Arctic, and Arctic states will need to build on this agreement and to create some holistic mechanism to govern marine areas in the Arctic.
Thank you for the two excellent questions. Just to follow up on Andre's point, or looking at Arctic Ocean governance, I mean, gaps is one approach, but I would highlight, and maybe I didn't do that in my presentation, but if you just look at kind of parameters of ocean governance, which is delineating maritime space, which you kind of have to do to get anywhere, the Arctic is a rather unique place. The Arctic is actually an outlier compared to other parts of the world where almost every maritime boundary has been settled. If you look around the globe, you look at the Mediterranean or East China, South China Sea, or the Caribbean, there's much more maritime disputes, maritime delimitation disputes than in the Arctic. The big remaining maritime dispute in the Arctic, or delimitation boundary dispute, is between Canada and the US, and it is a rather well-managed dispute. And all the others are settled, apart from the continental shelf extensions that I highlighted in my presentation. So I think that's also a positive starting point. And I think we've seen, and also back to the point that I made in my presentation about being preemptively, the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement, the fishery agreement bilaterally between Canada and the US in the Beaufort Sea. What we've seen, the developments between Norway and Russia with the Joint Fishery Commission bilaterally as well to manage the Barents Sea. We keep seeing that the Arctic states bilaterally or multilaterally are actually quite proactive in closing the gaps before issues really emerge. Not to say that there's not a problem, and I think Andrey Todorov's point on interdependence is very interesting. I mean, we could also look at safety issues, environmental response issues. I mean, yes, we have this search and rescue agreement under the auspices of the Arctic Council, but it just divides the Arctic into zones, doesn't actually provide capacity. Can more be done also on an operational level with the Coast Guards in the Arctic Coast Guard Forum, but that also looks more difficult now after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, given that we need Russia on board, especially from a Norwegian or a US-Alaska point of view. And then on your question on the Norwegian debate on what to do with the Arctic Council, I know that they're meeting right now in Tromsø. The Arctic Frontiers Conference is taking place as we're sitting here, so maybe they're not following our discussions, but they should. But I also know that these debates are taking place right now. I know that the Wilson Center, for once, is organizing a session on this topic. I can only guess at what will happen in a year from now when Norway is set to take over the chair of the Arctic Council. I will assume that Norway is interested in continuing cooperation, but I'm doubting that will be with Russia. So I'm assuming that you will have a A7 form of Arctic cooperation, probably not on a high-level foreign minister type meeting, but rather on a lower-level technocratic working group meeting, and with the hope of perhaps getting Russia back into the fold in some time in the near future. I don't see that happening within a year, but I don't also see it happening that the Arctic Council is just put on suspension for a long time, because I think the Arctic Council is too important and too unique for many of I mean the participants and the Arctic issues. But I'll love to hear your points on that as well, Fran, if you have any. Thanks.
You're muted, Fran. You're muted.
Sorry, I was just saying that I agree with what you just said. I think we're in a period of extreme uncertainty where people would very much like to go back to the way things were at the Arctic Council table, but that's not going to happen anytime soon. And yet the Arctic 7 have issues that they feel are sufficiently important and timely to move forward with. So I think there will be other ways, both multilateral and bilateral, progress on issues that need to be made, but exactly how, if, when the Arctic Council resumes anything close to what it once was is beyond the clarity of my crystal ball. The next question that we received online deals with legal, it's a legal rights question. How legitimate do you perceive parallels between Russian and Canadian claims to the Northern Sea Route and the Northwest Passage, respectively? In other words, how does Canada and Russia view those bodies of water, and how legitimate are those claims? How are they similar and how are they different?
Thanks for the question. So it's well known that Canada and Russia have a similar approach to these bodies of water along their coastal lines in the Arctic and Northern Sea Route and the Northwest Passage. And I would even say that Russia has followed, through the history, has followed the Canadian path in justifying their legal position on the status of these waters. But there is, to mention that Russia and USA and Canada and USA have a dispute over these waters. Russia consider the whole body of Northern Sea Route as national transport communication, and implements national regime for shipping through these waters. And the same goes for Canada in the Northwest Passage. And USA is of view that at least the straits of the Northern Sea route are international straits used for international navigation. And all ships navigating through these straits have freedom of navigation without the need to ask Russia for navigating there. And the same goes to the US position towards Canadian waters. I would say there is a big difference in these two cases because of the role that Canada and Russia play in the US foreign policies. Canada is one of the allies of USA, and a recent example of US Coast Guard icebreaker, US Coast Guard cutter icebreaker making a voyage through the Northwest Passage, not trying to raise this disagreement with Canada, but to it was a peaceful and cooperative voyage, and coast guards of two countries cooperated during this voyage and made some research. By the way, Canada and USA have an agreement from 80s that allow them to make such voyages through the Northwest Passage. With the understanding that their legal positions are intact. There is no such an agreement between Russia and USA, and the dispute is more tense, I would say, and there is, I would say, there is more risk and more chance that USA would send a US naval ship to the Northern Sea route instead of Northwest Passage, to claim their disagreement with Russia. Maybe not in nearest future, but someday when the ice conditions will allow them to do that. Yeah, I would answer this question in this way.
I'm just very glad I'm on the panel with a legal scholar, because as a political scientist, giving a clear definition of my position on a legal dispute that has been existing since the 70s, 60s. I don't think I'll dare to embark on that. I'm more interested in the conflict potential of that dispute. I recognize that there's two different positions, right? And that there's probably not going to be a solution anytime soon. But will this issue be used in a conflict? And as Andrey is highlighting, this agreement, this informal agreement also between Canada and the US, that the US will always notify, but Canada will always give permission, right? These things matter. But Russia has been building up its capacities along the Northern Sea route. You could argue that in some ways it is a response to differing legal positions on the sea route, that Russia is able to enforce its position and its sovereignty in these waters. And I also agree with Andrey that although we've seen some rhetoric now and again from US officials, especially under the Trump administration, highlighting that this is an issue where the US should push its position, I think it's highly unlikely. It causes more of a stir and a conflict than is needed right now. But it's one of these issues in the Arctic that, although, going back to the points earlier, although these are not issues that will cause outright conflict, most likely, unless you really push the issues, they are there and they need to be managed practically. Also goes for Svalbard and the disagreement that we both highlighted when it comes to the maritime zones around Svalbard. You're probably not going to find any agreement anytime soon, but you need to still practically manage these issues so they don't escalate, especially given the security context that we're in right now, where if they were to escalate, if they were to catch fire, if you will, then suddenly they get dragged into a whole different set of international politics that might make things much more difficult. So Fran, back to you.
Fran, let's go with another question online.
We've had several questions about China, and they are all phrased differently, but basically trying to understand your thoughts on how China's role in the Arctic, either to date or in the future, might affect the role that either a future Arctic Council or ocean governance in general might unfold. And this is particularly in the context right now of the differing political stance vis-a-vis Russia, with the assumption that Russia and China will be doing more business together. For example, China perhaps buying more oil and gas and hence more shipping going on, and just the extent to which China's involvement at this point in time in Arctic affairs might change. Either of you?
We can both embark on the China question. I mean, China's Arctic engagement is multifaceted, right? It's not either or. Sometimes you hear, and I heard in Washington D.C., that China is militarizing the Arctic, right? And that those type of comments doesn't really make sense to me. It's too simplistic. I mean, if we look at a specific issue like ocean governance, as we're talking about today, I mean, we could definitely debate Chinese interests in Arctic fisheries, right? There's been a concern over Chinese interests in Arctic fisheries. We haven't seen them materialize. They might in, say, a long time span. And China is one of the parties to the Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement for a reason. China's increased fishing activity in the Bering Sea or the North Pacific. I mean, Andrey and Fran, you could probably talk to that as well. Those are interesting dimensions, right, of China's Arctic interest. We could also, I mean, naturally talk about China as having a global interest in the Arctic, in a way that China has an interest in many parts of the world, as its say status or superpower stature is increasing for legitimate reasons, whether it might be research. I mean, China has research stations, has signed the Svalbard Treaty, is active there, is engaged also, Fran, as you highlight, in Russia when it comes to economic investments. But at the same time, China is also seeming to show an interest in the Arctic because the Arctic is of global interest. I mean, I think there is some symbolic positioning there as well, which again is also linking to what we talked about earlier about geopolitics. I mean, one of the ways that the Arctic is becoming more and more relevant in the global geopolitics is not because China is necessarily doing something in the Arctic, but it's because China is showing an interest in the Arctic, whether it's through research or potential investments in Greenland that we haven't seen, but a lot of talk about. And that Chinese interest is again spurring reactions from the West, in particular the US, primarily not because of immediate threats to China, in the Arctic, but because of a global power competition between the US or the West and China, because systemic rivalries. So suddenly the Arctic is being dragged into a more global or systemic rivalry, strategic one, between the West and China. I mean, which is, you can question, you know, what's the potential upsides for the Arctic in this scenario. It might be that China's resources, whether it's investments or academically, are also focused on the Arctic. China is engaging in the Arctic Council, although there's also been questions on how much of that engagement in the Arctic Council is actually helping driving the working groups onwards, right? It's been questions about China is there, but are they actually putting effort and money into Arctic cooperation there as well? So I mean, China's Arctic engagement is multifaceted on many layers, but it's very different than, say, Russia in the Arctic. The militarization argument that you hear doesn't really make sense when it comes to China, but it makes sense when it comes to Russia. So I think it's just important to nuance a bit also China's, say, Arctic interests. Andrey?
I would answer this question from the Russian perspective. I think that the interest of China to the Russian Arctic and talks about China in the Russian Arctics, to my opinion, a little bit exaggerated. Yes, China has a lot of interest in the Arctic oil and gas projects in the Russian Arctic. They have shares in Yamal LNG, Arctic LNG. They have a limited interest in shipping through the Northern Sea route, not only for shipments of resources from Russian Arctic, but also in terms of international transit. So far, they have been making test shipments through the Northern Sea route. I mean, transit shipping, and it's hard to say that the Chinese company COSCO is making these voyages, but so far I don't see major interest for shipping from China in terms of international transit in the Northern Sea route. And also I can mention that there were a lot of projects that China wanted to implement in the Russian Arctic, for example, a deep water port in Arkhangelsk, but they were not actually implemented. And there are a lot of examples of such engagement of China in the Russian Arctic. And also, I recently read an article about a question on the future of the Chinese engagement in the Arctic, taking into account that Russia is now isolated from the Arctic Council and from the rest of the Arctic nations. And in the West, there is a fear that China will increase its presence through Russia because of these sanctions and increase its presence in the Arctic. But I would say it also, I have my doubts about this because China is very cautious about supporting Russia, even in this Ukrainian crisis. And I think they are very pragmatic, and I don't see that China will increase its presence because of the current situation, geopolitical situation. I would be rather cautious about that.
I will just note that we have a lot of really excellent questions that we're probably not going to get to, but I'm going to squeeze in two of them and ask you to either respond to one or both if you choose to. One is what is the role of Indigenous people in Arctic ocean governance? And secondly, in terms of the Arctic region's current governance and cooperation agreements, are they adequate to deal with hard security matters? And if not, how should the Arctic states address those issues in the region? Either or both of you.
We could try, both of us. I think it's, one thing is to highlight what you're not an expert in, and I'm no expert on the role of Indigenous people in terms of Arctic governance structures. But I know that there are a lot of experts out there in the Arctic community, so hopefully they can help answer that question. Again, I think going back, but just on that point though, Fran, I think you had made a point in the intro remarks about the difference between the different Arctic countries, right? And I think that really applies to the role of Indigenous groups in especially ocean governance in the north, because there are different situations. Alaska is different from northern Canada, which is very different from the Scandinavian or Nordic Arctic, and the Russian Arctic is different again, in terms of how different systems are set up in terms of governance, right? The local, the regional, the state or the federal level, and what that also means for ocean governance. The territorial sea is one thing, and the exclusive economic zone is something different. But I'll leave it at that because I'm again no expert on Indigenous involvement. Security, I could talk more about. The problem is I don't really have a clear answer to your question, Fran. 3 months ago, if you'd asked me, I would have said that I'm supposed to be a scholar on this topic and not necessarily take a clear stance or push an agenda. But I would have said that we need more security dialogue in the Arctic with Russia. I mean, yes, we can have security dialogue amongst the NATO countries or the A7, which are now soon almost only 8 NATO countries. And that's probably good, but that doesn't help to solve the real problem, which is how do you avoid escalation in the Arctic with Russia? Because the end goal, right, from at least from a Norwegian perspective, and that's something I could provide being Norwegian and focusing on security, is that what we want is stability and cooperation and peace in the High North. I mean, High North, low tension is the slogan of the Norwegian government, and it's a goal, it's a desire. But that after events on February 24th, that's become less likely, right? And that's the paradoxical situation that we're seeing now, a fear of spillover into the Arctic. We haven't seen a spillover yet, at least in terms of, we haven't seen it in terms of more military activity or more threatening maneuvers from Russia in the Arctic vis-a-vis NATO, vis-a-vis Norway. We haven't seen that. But we might, I mean, that increased trend of military activity, military exercises that we've seen since 2014 is probably only going to increase in years to come. And if Sweden and Finland joins NATO, that also changes completely the security dynamics in the Arctic or in the European parts of the Arctic, making everything even more tense. Again, spurring an even greater need for dialogue with Russia on security matters. But that dialogue seems very far off right now. I do think there's a need to separate between, say, the overarching political dialogue. Yes, it's probably unlikely that within a few years now that we will have any kind of political ministerial meeting between a European head of state and a Russian head of state talking about the Arctic. But we could have practical cooperation or practical agreements, at least, that are aimed to reduce tension, like the incidents at sea agreement that was, say, signed last year between Norway and Russia, which was an update from a 1990s agreement on how to manage specific incidents at sea. And that was one of the points, and I think this is my final remark as well, given the time, the points that I was trying to make in my presentation, that these ocean governance issues, especially that relates to fisheries, in the parts of the Arctic where a NATO country is bordering at sea, bordering Russia, these issues are actually not only about how to ensure sustainable management of fish stocks. They also have a conflict potential and an escalating, a spiraling conflict potential, given the current security context. So you need to find mechanisms to alleviate that pressure if you have an incident at sea. If you have, for example, the arrest of a Russian trawler outside of Svalbard, that might escalate because of unforeseen actions or willing actions by some parties. How do you take the tension out of small scale incidents so that they don't become an outright conflict in the Arctic? I don't have the answer to that, but I think practical cooperation and dialogue is still needed. Andrey?
I would absolutely agree with everything that Andreas told. I think that especially after February 2022, we need to restore dialogue in hard security issues in the Arctic, because after 2014, after the first Ukrainian crisis, every dialogue platform in the Arctic for security issues was suspended. So Russia was excluded from every institution. And we see how this spillover effect is increasing in the Arctic. Britain has declared that it will increase its presence in the Arctic. More military exercises should be expected, especially in the North Atlantic and Bering Sea region. So to avoid the risks of miscalculation, especially when it comes to SNAP exercises, the parties should keep at least operational line of communication. I don't know. I know that Norway has kept the hotline with Russia, with the Russian Northern Fleet. I don't know what's the situation right now. Andreas, do you know if they still keep the hotline? Yeah, that's good. But to be on the safe side, we should think of reestablishing these inclusive dialogues with Russia on hard security issues. It's very important. As for indigenous peoples, I also agree with Andreas that it differs from nation, from Arctic states to Arctic state, from subregion to subregion. For example, in the Bering Strait region, the influence of local communities on decision making is higher, I suppose, than in the Barents Sea, because of the population there is consists mostly of indigenous peoples. For example, in 2008, so indigenous peoples in the Bering Strait called for action from the U.S. Coast Guard to protect the marine environment there, and the 2018 IMO measure two-way separation scheme in the Bering Strait was implemented, not least because of the interests of local indigenous peoples. So I will stop there also. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. I agree with what you've said. I would just add that the Indigenous Peoples organizations called permanent participants at the Arctic Council has been unusual in most international fora. And it has been an incredibly important part of the participation so far in terms of Indigenous people in Arctic issues. And however the Arctic 7 might proceed in the future, hopefully someday as the Arctic 8, I have no doubt that the Indigenous participation through the permanent participants will be an important piece of our being able to do the business moving forward in whatever format that might be. I do want to thank you both for your presentations, for the answers to the questions, and I'm sorry we didn't get to all of the questions, but it's been a robust dialogue that I know has shed a lot of light on both what has been and what may be in the future in both the Barents and the Bering Sea region and the Arctic as a whole. So thanks again to all of you for joining us today. With that, we are adjourned.